One of the most popular types of videos that I make here on the Guitar Historian channel are the videos that look back on iconic years through the albums that were released. Next up is the year that most of you have requested as having some of the best albums ever made. But how does it stack up? We're going to find out next as we look at 55 years ago to the year 1967 through its iconic moments and albums next on If Guitars Could Speak. First off, a little history of 1967, a year of great change and upheaval all over the world. In January of 1967, in the hippie capital of the world, San Francisco, California, the stage would be set with The Human Be-In on January 14th. The next day, on the 15th, the Green Bay Packers would best the Kansas City Chiefs in the first AFL-NFL World Championship game, soon to be shortened to the now ubiquitous Super Bowl. On January 27th, the American space program would suffer its first major tragedy as Gus Grissom, Roger Chaffee, and Ed White are killed in a tragic fire during a test of their Apollo 1 capsule. On February 18th, New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison would announce his investigation into the JFK assassination, igniting a firestorm of controversy that would be immortalized in Oliver Stone's 1991 film JFK. On 1 March, the Queen Elizabeth Hall is opened in London, featuring a performance by English composer and pianist Benjamin Britten. Later on, the 11th, the Cambodian Civil War would begin against the Khmer Rouge. On March 18th, the iconic Disney ride The Pirates of the Caribbean would ferry riders through the dark underworld for the first time. Despite asking to stay in prison, Charles Manson would be released on March 21st, relocating to San Francisco. On April 24th, my hometown Philadelphia 76ers would win their first title against the San Francisco Warriors. Interestingly, the Warriors had been Philadelphia's NBA team until 1962, when the then Syracuse Nationals would move to Philadelphia and rename themselves the 76ers. On May 1, Elvis and Priscilla would get married in, where else? Las Vegas. On May 25th, Celtic FC would become the first Northern European team to win the European Cup, now known as the Champions League. On June 5th, the Six-Day War would begin with the armies of Syria, Iraq, Egypt, and Jordan beginning an offensive against Israel. On June 13th, President Lyndon Johnson would nominate Thurgood Marshall to the U.S. Supreme Court, and he would be confirmed as the first African-American Supreme Court Justice later on August 30th. On July 4th, the UK government would officially decriminalize homosexuality. On July 29th, the serious escalation to the Vietnam War would occur when an explosion and fire aboard the USS Forrestal in the Gulf of Tonkin would occur. One of the worst of America's long, hot summer of race riots would occur in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on July 30th and lead to a 10-day shutdown of the city. Rock fans are quick to remember the free psychedelia of the Summer of Love, but African Americans in the U.S. have a very different memory of the summer of 1967. On August 15th, the UK Parliament would pass the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act, leading to a golden age of so-called pirate radio coming to an end, despite some stations such as Radio Caroline defying the order and continuing to illegally broadcast. On August 25th, George Lincoln Rockwell, leader of the American Nazi Party, is assassinated in Virginia. No big loss there. On September 5th, the seminal and influential sci-fi TV series The Prisoner would have its debut on Canadian TV. On October 26th, future American Senator John McCain would be shot down and taken prisoner in North Vietnam, where he would remain for more than 5 years. On October 27th, the legendary Kray twins, London underworld bosses, would murder rival Jack McVitie, leading to their eventual downfall. On November 9th, NASA would launch the first Saturn V rocket, the vehicle that would eventually bring the United States to the moon about 18 months later. On December 11th, the supersonic Concorde would finally be unveiled in France. And finally, on December 31st, motorcycle stuntman Evel Knievel attempted to jump 141 feet over the fountain at Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas. He failed. And now onto the albums and music of 1967. 1967 would begin with 1966's debut album from the Monkees, reigning supreme in the midst of a 13-week run at the top spot of the Billboard album charts in the US. It would be replaced in February by their second album, and the Monkees would go on to have 4 albums make the top spot through 1967, dominating most of the year. But the winds of change would start to blow early as the rock scene started to pivot towards more adult, darker themes. The Young Rascals released their second effort, Collections, on the 9th, and on the 13th, Manfred Mann put out their own collection of mostly instrumental tunes called Soul of Man. The Rolling Stones began their heavy pivot towards psychedelia, releasing Between the Buttons, which featured Ruby Tuesday. And January 15th, the Stones would appear on The Ed Sullivan Show, changing the words to their hit Let's Spend the Night Together to Let's Spend Some Time Together. On the 30th, we got the debut album from the Stone Ponies, which featured the earliest recording material by future superstar Linda Ronstadt. But the big release from January was on the 4th, when we would get the debut album from California band The Doors. The album would slowly climb the charts throughout the new year, eventually getting stuck behind a certain Beatle album that we'll get to in a little bit. But with the release of Light My Fire, written by Doors guitarist Robbie Krieger, the Doors would become megastars, capped by the 11-plus minute Oedipal epic The End. The album marked a tonal shift in rock music towards openly celebrating the drug culture of the late 1960s. February started off with a bang on the 1st with our big release of the month, the second album from another California band that was closely related to the Doors, Surrealistic Pillow from Jefferson Airplane. Best known for the 2 iconic singles, Somebody to Love and White Rabbit, both fronted by the powerfully voiced Grace Slick, the album was yet another cornerstone in 1967's embrace of the drug counterculture. White Rabbit will go on to become the theme song of that culture going forward, making countless appearances in movies and television for decades. Other releases in February included the 3rd album by the Mamas and the Papas, called Deliver. The Byrds released their 4th album, Younger Than Yesterday. And on February 12th, the British police would raid Keith Richards' home in Redlands and charge both Richards and Mick Jagger with drug possession. On the 13th, we would get the debut album by future country megastar, and I do mean megastar, Dolly Parton, with Hello, I'm Dolly. John Mayall's Blues Breakers would follow up their seminal 1966 Beano album with a new guitarist, named Peter Green, and put out A Hard Road, which some fans called a more complete album. Donovan also released his 4th album, Mellow Yellow, featuring the hit song released the year before. March would be a big month for debut albums. We would see the first efforts of many diverse artists, such as Cat Stevens with his debut Matthew and Son. Artist Andy Warhol's project, The Velvet Underground, would release their seminal self-titled debut with German model and singer Nico. Soul singer Al Green released his first, titled Backup Train. And our last debut is also our marquee release from March, the first album from yet another California band, The Grateful Dead. Recorded in only 4 days, drummer Bill Kreutzmann remembered, quote, "The recorded versions failed to capture the energy that we had when we performed them live. We weren't that good yet. We were still learning how to be a band." The album was mostly reworked blues standards, but it definitely set the stage for the band's future sound and success. Other notable releases from March include Aretha Franklin's I've Never Loved a Man the Way I Love You, which is famous for carrying Franklin's most well known hit, Respect. And one of the first massive selling greatest hits albums by Bob Dylan would be released on the 27th, with Dylan being down after his motorcycle accident in the summer of '66. The album remains his biggest selling release in the United States, being certified 5 times platinum. April seemed a slow month for releases, with only a few albums being released. Former R&B outfit The Pretty Things released their third album, Emotions, an album that forced many of the original band members out due to arguments about the band's direction. The Blues Magoos would put out their second effort, Electric Comic Book. Folk artist Tim Hardin released his aptly titled second album called Two. And the Turtles' third album would feature the quintessential song of the 60s, Happy Together, on the album of the same name. On May 2nd, Capitol Records would cancel the Beach Boys' Smile project after Brian Wilson's nervous breakdown makes him unable to finish it after working on the album for over a year. The sessions would be repackaged and finally released in 2011. But of the albums that were released in May, we would get the debut album from the counterculture icons Country Joe and the Fish called Electric Music for the Mind and Body. Zappa's Mothers of Invention would release their second album, Absolutely Free. And on the 12th, the Jimi Hendrix Experience would shock the world with their unbelievably packed debut, Are You Experienced? Easily one of the best albums of the decade, it introduced the world to the greatest and most important electric guitarist who ever lived. Featuring hits like Purple Haze, Manic Depression, Fire, Foxy Lady, The Wind Cries Mary, and Hey Joe, this album is just top notch, but it's not our top release from this month. What could possibly beat this album? Well, it's Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. What can you say about Sgt. Pepper's that hasn't already been said by countless rock historians and critics? For me personally, the most interesting part of this album is how the Beatles branched out from the standard rock formula of guitars, bass, drums, and they used orchestras, various organs, groundbreaking recording techniques to create a new sonic soundscape, the likes of which had never been heard before. Easily the most important rock album of the 60s, and maybe the most important rock album ever. June would be another month with a couple of notable debut albums. On the first, young singer-songwriter David Bowie would release his first self-named album. Sonically interesting and well-reviewed by critics, it definitely showcased Bowie's talent, but David wouldn't break into the big time until his 1969 hit, Space Oddity. Another California band whose hype was bigger than their eventual success, Moby Grape released their first self-titled album. The band created a major buzz among the record companies, causing a bidding war eventually won by Columbia Records. Another debut from the Strange Files would be from Star Trek actor Leonard Nimoy, whose debut album, Mr. Spock Presents Music from Outer Space. Other releases came from the Small Faces with their self-titled second album, The Association with their third album, Insight Out, which featured their hits Windy and Never My Love. The Hollies released their sixth album, Evolution, and Stax Records house band, and legends Booker T and the MGs put out their fifth album, Hip Hug Her. On the 25th of the month, the Beatles would appear live on the Our World television broadcast, the first worldwide broadcast ever, performing All You Need Is Love. But the big moment from June wasn't an album. It was the weekend of June 16th through 18th, when the Monterey Pop Festival was held in California. One of the world's first large outdoor festivals, it featured seminal performances and iconic moments by a number of acts including The Who, Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, Janis Joplin, and Otis Redding with Booker T and the MGs. The success of the festival would go on to inspire future large festivals to mixed success. In July, we got the sixth release from classic British trailblazers The Shadows, with their first fully instrumental release called Jigsaw. The Bee Gees would release the misnomer Bee Gees first, despite releasing 2 albums in Australia previously. This album would be their first international release and feature a cover designed by Klaus Voormann, who had won a Grammy for designing the Beatles' 1966 release Revolver. The Yardbirds released their first album with Jimmy Page as lead guitarist called Little Games, and we would get the debut album from California blues rock outfit Canned Heat, which was actually their second crack at recording a debut after the initial attempt, which would be released later in 1970 as Vintage Heat. The Young Rascals put out their third album, Groovin', featuring the hit single of the same name. It would also be the last album before the band dropped the Young from their name, eventually going on to be known as just the Rascals. Yet another month in which we had a number of landmark debut albums. We would get first efforts from the Sunshine pop group Spanky and Our Gang, featuring their biggest hit, the #1 Sunday Will Never Be the Same. The Janis Joplin-fronted Big Brother and the Holding Company put out their first self-titled album, but their big hit would come a year later with 1968's Cheap Thrills. Heavy rock pioneers Vanilla Fudge would also drop their first album, featuring halftime dirges of popular tunes like You Keep Me Hanging On and Ticket to Ride. Frank Zappa stepped out from behind the Mothers to release his first orchestra-heavy solo album called Lumpy Gravy. Written by Zappa, he did not actually perform an instrument on the album. We also got releases like Aretha Franklin's 11th album, Aretha Arrives, and the Electric Prune's second album, Underground. We would also see the first public performance from the British blues supergroup formed by Peter Green called Fleetwood Mac on the 13th at the Windsor Jazz and Blues Festival. But the big album release from August would be the debut from Pink Floyd, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. This album was the pinnacle of the psychedelic movement and the peak of artistic output from Floyd's enigmatic and troubled first leader, guitarist Syd Barrett. Recorded at the same time in Abbey Road Studios as the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's album, these two albums truly marked the golden age of analog studio recording. I put out a special edition of Forgotten Fretmasters all about Syd Barrett, so if you're a big Floyd fan, be sure to check that out right up here. Another month chock full of debut albums. 1967 was truly a breeding ground for new music. On the first, we got the debut album from Procol Harum, from the surprise hit Whiter Shade of Pale that they had enjoyed earlier in May. An early progenitor of the yet-to-be-named prog rock movement, this album and band would go on to become highly influential in the coming years. We also got a debut album from folk singer Arlo Guthrie with Alice's Restaurant, named for his most well-known hit. English baritone Scott Walker put out his debut, simply titled Scott. Captain Beefheart and his Magic Band's debut, Safe as Milk, featured a 20-year-old Ry Cooder on guitar. And fresh out of the band Them, the Northern Irish singer Van Morrison would release his first solo album called Blowin' Your Mind, and feature his first solo hit, the timeless Brown Eyed Girl. The Beach Boys would release the muddy Smiley Smile, an attempt to salvage some of the Smile sessions from earlier in the year, yet the album would be one of the Beach Boys' first commercial failures. But the marquee record from September would be the second effort from The Doors, called Strange Days. The band could be accused of copying the formula of their first album fairly closely, but my opinion is that if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Following up their first album with more hits like People Are Strange, Love Me Two Times, and Moonlight Drive, and capping it off with epic When the Music's Over, the album built upon the Doors' sound while cementing the band's writing chops and showing that they were no one-album wonder. The Doors would also famously appear on Ed Sullivan on the 17th of this month, with Morrison singing Girl We Couldn't Get Much Higher, despite being asked to sing better by Sullivan's handlers. The slip would lead to Sullivan banning the Doors from future appearances, as well as beginning the bad boy persona surrounding lead singer Jim Morrison. Bit of a slower month, October, but of course still full of interesting releases. We got debuts from the long-lived and influential blues rock group 10 Years After, and the first appearance of future Forgotten Fretmaster Alvin Lee. There's a little teaser for you. The new lineup of Eric Burdon and the Animals released their first effort titled Winds of Change. Sly and the Family Stone released their debut as well, called A Whole New Thing. And another interesting debut from the satirical Bonzo Dog Doodah band called Gorilla would lead to that band's leader, Neil Innes, having a hand in the future comedy troupe Monty Python. Stax Records' darling Sam and Dave would release Soul Man, featuring the iconic guitar riff on Soul Man by one of our previous forgotten fretmasters, Steve Cropper. We also got another seminal 60s release when Strawberry Alarm Clock released the album Incense and Peppermints, creating one of the most well-known 60s anthems ever. Co-written by future Lynyrd Skynyrd guitarist Ed King, the song checked every box that you'd need to produce the most well-known psychedelic song of all time. On the 17th, in pop culture news, the iconic musical Hair made its debut off-Broadway, and on October 18th, the very first issue of Rolling Stone magazine would roll off the presses, featuring a photo of John Lennon in the movie How I Won the War. The magazine would be dated November 9, 1967, and Love It or Hate It would go on to become the most influential and important rock magazine of all time. November saw some acts try to follow up their prior success both in this year and the year prior. We got debuts from the band Kaleidoscope with Tangerine Dream, an underrated psychedelic album that got swallowed up by other releases. The Amboy Dukes released their first self-titled album featuring future 70s guitar hero Ted Nugent. Despite Nugent's insistence that he has never done drugs or alcohol, the Dukes' early sound was fully awash with the psychedelic sound of the season, and track 1 on side 2 was called Let's Go Get Stoned. Okay. We also got second albums from both Buffalo Springfield and the Moody Blues, whose Days of Future Past would heavily influence the burgeoning prog rock genre, but interestingly wouldn't achieve any commercial success until 1972, when the song Nights in White Satin would eventually achieve airplay on FM radio. We also got the Beatles' follow-up to Sgt. Pepper's with Magical Mystery Tour, which was released as an unsuccessful TV special of the same name later in December. Released as a soundtrack in the UK with only 6 songs on the first side, the US version is now generally regarded as the official version of that album, having tacked on Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, and All You Need Is Love among other songs on the second side. The general critical failure of the album would lead the Beatles towards a more back-to-basics approach for their next album. But what release could beat the Beatles for the biggest release of the month? Well, that honor has to go to the supergroup Cream and their second album, Disraeli Gears. Featuring 3 musicians at the absolute top of their games respectively, Disraeli Gears definitely showed the influence that Jimi Hendrix had on Cream's lead guitarist Eric Clapton, with Clapton's use of fuzz, wah pedals, and embracing a newer style of blues-based riffs mixed with power pop sensibilities. This album is another one of the pillars of 60s rock, one of the most important albums of the decade. "1967 isn't going out without a bang, is it? December 1, right away, we get the second album from the Jimi Hendrix Experience, Axis, Bold as Love. A short, tight affair without a moment for the listener to catch their breath. In my opinion, this album is a little less pretentious and showcases the band a bit more than its mesmerizing lead singer. This album is often forgotten between Are You Experienced and Electric Ladyland, but it's actually my favorite Hendrix album. We also got the debut album from Steve Winwood's Traffic with Mr. Fantasy. The band would go through many lineup and stylistic changes over the next few years. The Who's third album, The Who Sell Out, featured the band's first foray into a loose concept album, with the band poking fun at the commercialization of English culture at the time. The single from the album, I Can See for Miles, was much loved by its writer Pete Townsend, who said, quote, I spat on the English record buyer after calling it the ultimate Who record. We also got the debut from all-time songwriter Leonard Cohen, with Songs by Leonard Cohen. The Beach Boys went soul with their 13th album, Wild Honey, and Bob Dylan made his return from his accident with a return to mostly acoustic instrumentation on John Wesley Harding. On December 9th, Jim Morrison would cement his bad boy image when he would be arrested in New Haven for indecent exposure, and the next day, iconic soul artist Otis Redding would be killed in a plane crash in Wisconsin, with soul fans calling it the second day the music died. But the most important album release of this month goes to the Rolling Stones with their December 8th release, their Satanic Majesty's Request. Despite this album not being anywhere near the Stones' best release, it was more about what the album meant for the Stones' future direction. Clearly coming at the end of the psychedelic explosion, the album seemed overproduced and just a moment too late. It exacerbated the rift between blues purist Brian Jones and songwriters Jagger and Richards and led the band to rethink their musical future. Ironically, the rift would not be repaired despite the Stones moving back towards a more stripped down and bluesy sound for the next release, Beggar's Banquet, but the release of Satanic definitely made the Stones take a long, hard look at their copycat tendencies, and this would lead to a run of albums over the next few years that would cement the Stones as the only real rivals to the Beatles' claim of the best band ever. Wow. What can you say about 1967? I mean, it clearly stands up as one of, if not the best years of musical output of all time. There was simply so much creativity going on in those middle 60s, so many bands, and every single one seemed to possess so much talent, especially for singing and songwriting. It seemed like everywhere you turned, there was a forgotten hit from that period. Say, that sounds like not a bad idea for a future video series. Anyway, as always, make sure you subscribe to our channel for so much more content like this, and of course, thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.